One of the things that Josh and I want to start out with is kind of the big picture. And this big picture comes on the heels of the results in Alabama. Our general position has been for a while, and it's certainly true in this poll as well, is that Tennessee is certainly a conservative state, but it's a little bit more moderate than conventional wisdom would lead you to believe. And question after question documents that in a pretty compelling fashion. And so that's kind of the overview that we want to start with. And the very first slide that we have documents this in two interesting ways. We do a very classic kind of approach where we ask Tennesseans to rate Donald Trump, Governor Haslam, the Tennessee state legislature, and their fellow citizens on a liberal conservative scale. And as you can see, Haslam is viewed, for example, as the most moderate of these, even though he's still viewed as conservative. Tennessee state legislature more so, Trump more so. But your fellow citizens, that is the fellow Tennesseans, that is the most conservatively rated group, so to speak. 45, in fact, if you add up the two, 62% of Tennesseans think their fellow Tennesseans are conservative. So, in fact, that's the most conservative group of the four. That's in and of itself interesting, but it's the next slide that I think is far more telling, because we also ask people in a separate question where they actually fall. And as you can see, there is a gap. The Tennesseans think their fellow citizens are much more conservative than they actually are. That when you actually look at the ideological breakdown of Tennesseans, about half are conservative or very conservative, the other half are moderate, liberal, or very liberal. That's a very different kind of picture than the perceptions. And those perceptions are driven in part because the news media, social media, other things like this tend to give voice to the more extreme elements, where the more moderate and quiet individuals that dot the landscape of the state aren't being counted in those kinds of undertakings. And polls, in fact, do give voice to those individuals. So this is a particularly important thing, especially in this day and age when we have so much polarization, we have so much controversy along partisan lines. And that's true for both parties. This is not a partisan statement. The Democrats are as guilty of it as the Republicans. This pattern continues when you look at the commitment that Tennesseans have for their legislative leaders to work together across party lines, or do you want to just stick to your own values in your own party and not compromise? And again, the ratios are dramatic. 76% of Tennesseans want their legislators to work together. Only 19% say just stay pure to your values. In some sense, it's kind of like a Judge Roy Moore versus someone like maybe a Doug Jones or someone else who's interested in compromise and working together. And this is a very stark difference. And again, fits this general pattern that we're talking about. And even if you break that down by partisanship, even members of the Tea Party, self-identified members of the Tea Party, also want, at a rate of basically 2 to 1, want their legislators to work together. And so this is an important pattern. And we'll both be talking about this more. People want things done. The next slide we have is approval of our statewide leaders, including the U.S. Congress and the state legislature. As you can see, Corker and Alexander are down a little bit, along with the Tennessee state legislature. Governor Haslam is up a couple of points. Interestingly, Congress is also down. And so what's going on is that Haslam does not have the drag of Congress that both Senator Alexander and Senator Corker have. And as you can see, those numbers align quite nicely. There was a big drop from 31% approval of Congress in the state to 23%, and that's pulling down Corker and Alexander a little bit. And again, as I said, Haslam is up. We again, and this is again consistent with what's going across the country, is we have a slide next on Trump's approval over time. And again, you see it's fraying. He started out in November after the election with 60% approval. It went down to 52% in May, and now it stands at 48%. Less than half of Tennesseans approve of the president. And remember, he had a 25-point victory over Hillary Clinton in November of 2016. So even in this state, which was one of his absolute bases of support, he's weakening a little bit. And that continues when you ask people, do they think that that Washington's going to be changing for the better or for the worse? And the proportion that think Washington's changing for the better is dropping from November of 16 to November of 17. And the proportion that thinks things are getting worse is on the rise. Again, a story consistent with what's going on nationally and in particular in the state of Alabama. And then finally, before I turn it over to Josh, we ask a question about how much of the time does President Trump tell the truth? Now, let me start first with saying that just asking this question is a sign of our times. We normally would never ask such a question, but because there's been so many stories about the kinds of claims that the president have made, we decide to ask it. So it's at one level not easy to put in context because it turns out only 40% of Tennesseans, 39% to be exact, but 40% of Tennesseans think he tells the truth most of the time. Is that high or low? Well, if all of a sudden we ask a whole bunch of people, let's say my friends, how often does John Geer tell the truth? And only 40% said most of the time, I'd view that pretty disappointing. And I suspect that if if my employer thought that was the case, I'd be likely out of a job. These are pretty telling numbers, again, consistent with the overall narrative. And if you break it down by party, you find the differences you'd expect. Republicans are much more likely to believe that Trump is telling the truth than Democrats. That's true. But if you look among groups of independents, again, the numbers are quite telling. It is not a story that's very favorable to the president right now. And again, this comes from a state that's exceptionally was one of a key part of his base. And I'm going to turn it over to Josh.
So on slide 11, we start delving into the approval of the U.S. Congress by partisanship, and kind of this is trying to unpack that decline that we saw at the outset, where the approval of Congress goes from 31% in May down to 23%. And if you look on slide 11, and particularly you zero in on the support among Republicans and Tea Party, you can see that this is what's causing the dramatic shift. So in May of 47% of Republicans approved of the job the Republican-led Congress was doing. In our latest poll, that number has plummeted to 33%. Among those who self-identify as the Tea Party, which is about 12% in our latest poll, in May, 43% of them approved of the job the Republican Congress was doing. As of our last poll, that number has gone down to 16%. And so the decline that we see in Tennessee among registered voters for the U.S. Congress is driven entirely by Republicans and members of the Tea Party, which raises interesting questions about what might be going on. Is that a kind of a reaction to the failure to repeal Obamacare, for example, or is that a statement about kind of what the Republican agenda is? And that's difficult to unpack, but we asked a series of questions that tried to get at that just a little bit. And so on slide 12, for example, we asked a question about a broad question about their views on the U.S. tax system and kind of what they thought was more important. And you can see overwhelmingly registered voters in the state thought it was much more important to reduce personal income taxes than lowering the corporate tax rate. And only 6% said that both were equally important. So there's a clear preference to prioritize personal income taxes over corporate taxes among registered voters in Tennessee. On slide 13, when we break this down by partisanship, we can see that this is a view that's consistent across party lines. That is to say, if we look at those who say it's more important to reduce personal income taxes, 53% of Republicans agree with that statement, 74% of Democrats, and 58% of independents. So regardless of your partisanship, registered voters in Tennessee think the most important thing to do is to reduce personal income taxes. There's much less enthusiasm for prioritizing corporate taxes over reducing personal income taxes. On slide 14, we look at kind of, again, continuing trends towards the future of healthcare system over time, a question that we've been asking for some time now because of its critical importance not only to the national agenda, but also to the state in of itself. And here again, I think there's pretty remarkable and stunning findings. So in particular, if we look at the 4 different options that we give our respondents, whether or not it should be repealed and not replaced, whether it should be replaced with a Republican alternative, whether the Affordable Care Act should be built upon, or whether a single-payer system should be kept and should be kind of established, we see a pretty remarkable shift in public opinion towards these options. So in November, for example, in 2016, right after the election, and that's the purple line there. So if you look at the two, we'll call them the more conservative options, that it should be repealed and not replaced. 21% of the population of registered voters in Tennessee thought that, and 29% thought that it should be replaced with a Republican alternative. So nearly 50% of registered voters in Tennessee and in November thought, we'll call it a Republican option for health care should be enacted. Now in our latest poll, that number has plummeted to 35%. Only 35% of registered voters in Tennessee think that the healthcare system should either be repealed and not replaced or replaced with a Republican alternative. Even among Republicans, the percentage who support one of those two options is only around 50%. So I think that what you see is that there's, as that discussion occurred, there was pretty remarkable shift among registered voters' opinions on kind of what they thought the future of the healthcare system would be, with the movement kind of away from kind of repealing or kind of replacing the Republican alternative. Another kind of question that kind of obviously touches deeply on the state of Tennessee is on slide 15. We ask about how severe opioid addiction, how big of a problem that is. And as you can see, not surprisingly, there's huge bipartisan support that this is kind of a pretty major issue. 40% across party lines think that state emergency, and the other half basically say it's a major problem but not an emergency. So basically across the state, no one thinks that this is a minor problem. There's, and that's bipartisan agreement on the severity of that problem. Also related to kind of the issue of health care, and again, I think highlighting, circling back to what John said at the beginning about the importance of thinking about Tennesseans as being kind of a lot more pragmatic and thinking about solving problems rather than kind of thinking in strictly partisan terms. We also asked them about the views about rural hospital closings and kind of the healthcare infrastructure in the state. And again, you see that regardless of whether it's urban, rural, or suburban, there's strong, nearly 90% of registered voters think that the closing of rural hospitals is a concerning problem. And this is true also across partisan lines and across geography. Basically, there's no one who disagrees that the closing of rural hospitals in the state is an area of a serious concern. On slide 17, then, we ask a little bit about how much funding from either the federal government or the state government, how much the respondents would support state funding to help keep those rural hospitals open. And again, you see very strong support for government intervention to help support rural hospitals and to kind of make sure they stay open. 56% agree with the federal government stepping in to help rural hospitals, and 71% agree with the claim that the state government should step in to help to prop up and kind of support rural hospitals. And again, that's a largely bipartisan story. So, registered voters are kind of supportive of the state, kind of getting involved in healthcare and helping to support struggling rural hospitals to make sure that they remain open and residents have access to those facilities. So on slide 18, again, we're switching topics a little bit and thinking about the question of what to do about immigration. You again see a pretty standard and continuing story that we've shown pretty consistently, in that Tennesseans, 58% think that those who are illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants should stay and apply for citizenship, and only 25% think they should be required to leave the United States. And so again, the wording on this is always a little bit issue. Whether you ask about legal immigrants or undocumented immigrants, you might think that would change your opinions. And so this particular poll, we asked it both ways, and we found very similar answers. There doesn't matter whether you call it undocumented immigrants or illegal immigrants, you get exactly the same or nearly exactly the same kind of respondents. And so again, going back to the claim about Tennessee being more moderate than you might get the impression of, on slide 19, we break that down by partisanship. And so here you do see some partisan divisions, but perhaps less than people might suspect based on dialogue that occurs at the national level. So if you think about the percentage who think that they should be able to stay and apply for citizenship, right, have a pathway to citizenship, not surprisingly, 80% of registered Democrats think that that's the case. And 57% of independents, but even 43% of Republicans in the state who are registered voters think that there should be a pathway to citizens for kind of undocumented or illegal, immigrants. Only 35% of Republicans think that they should be required, to leave the United States. Building on this notion about, Tennesseans as kind of problem solvers and kind of having more bipartisan or kind of more moderate views than might be, conceived of, is on slide 20, we ask about whether or not undocumented immigrants in the state should be eligible for in-state tuition for their children. And here, this replicates a question that we asked in May. And here again, we find strong bipartisan support for that this should be the case. 72%, in fact, in our latest survey say that children of undocumented immigrants in the state should be able to pay in-state tuition to attend colleges and universities in the state. That's up 6% from kind of May. And so again, and that's true, across party lines as well. So again, there's strong support in the state for allowing children of undocumented immigrants to kind of have in-state tuition. And slide 21, we asked about kind of views on charter schools, kind of another issue that's sometimes in the news at the state. And here you see that public views are really, they don't really know what to make of it. By far and away, the largest response is 48% don't have a clear enough opinion, and then another 20% have mixed feelings. So by and large, right, this is an issue that the public does not have strong opinions on. 70% either don't have a strong opinion, or they have mixed opinions. And so that's a very fluid debate and a policy issue where the public has not yet reached a resolution on its views. And then finally, before I turn it over to John on slide 22, just kind of continues the perceptions of the economy, just to get a sense of kind of where people think the state and the nation are. And there's been a slight decline, but those are all kind of within margin of error. So basically, there's not a whole lot of change in how people think the economy are doing between May and December. And with that, I'll turn it over to John to talk about name recognition for candidates for running for office in Tennessee.
Yeah, so we asked questions about all the candidates for both governor and now for Senate, since that race has been transformed by Phil Bredesen's announcement, and then prior, obviously, Senator Corker's decision not to seek re-election. Just for the record, we chose not to ask about approval of these candidates, and the reason we did not want to ask about approval is simply too early. There are candidates, if you go to slide 22, I think it is. I've got to get my glasses, actually. 23. If you go to slide 23, you can see that, let's say you take Bill Lee, his numbers are 14% in both things. There'd only be 14% that would rate him favorable or unfavorable, and I'm not sure what to do with that. And you can become very famous in this state or in this country very quickly. So these numbers will change a lot by May. And there's been nobody who's gone down. A couple have gone up. Notably, Diane Black has gone up 10 percentage points, but I would probably attribute that to the fact that Marsha Blackburn is obviously running for the U.S. Senate, and there's probably going to be some confusion in the public between Blackburn and Black. So in both cases, their numbers may be a little bit maybe a bit artificial, a little bit higher than they actually are, just because of the confusion of the two names. We did this by region. And again, the numbers work as you'd expect. Someone like Carl Dean is very well known in Nashville. Harwell is known well in Nashville. Black, et cetera. And you can see Randy Boyd has more awareness, higher name recognition in the East. Again, that all makes good sense. If you go to the Senate race, again, you can see that among the reasons why Phil Bredesen chose to run, he's still very well known. I mean, he has not faced the public in an election since 2006. He obviously stepped down in governor in January of 2011, but he's still very well known and very comparable numbers to Marsha Blackburn. Steve Fincher's numbers are significantly lower, but he is pretty well known in the West with about 48%, which we see in the next, I think it's in the next slide. So that varies along the ways you would think about it. Of course, James Mackler's decision yesterday to drop out makes discussion about his numbers of less relevance, but we have these baseline. We'll again ask for name recognition come May, but we almost certainly will ask by then probably approval because it'll become more relevant. And then the final slide, before we take any questions, is just a time series, which we've been doing from the very beginning, about the top 3 priorities of government over time. And as you can see, that healthcare and the economy continue to vie for number one, and that was true in our May poll, and that had not been the case prior, because obviously the Great Recession made the economy the first priority for a long period of time, and it's been slowly declining because the economy is getting better and concerns about healthcare have been growing, and so that pattern is picked up. And then we do, I guess it isn't the final slide, we do one by different regions just to see where people stand on the various issues, and it works along the lines you would think. So I think at this point in time, if there are any questions, we're happy to take them. And thanks for your time.